My husband took off his wedding ring, placed it in my hand, and told me to leave our house right away. There was no explanation, no argument, and no warning. Less than 24 hours later, I stood down the street watching police cars surround that same house. That was the moment I realized the man I thought had betrayed me might have actually saved my life. My name is Ren Holloway. For 7 years, I trusted my husband, Gideon Mercer, more than anyone else in the world. He was my best friend, my partner, and a person I believed would always stand beside me. Then one rainy Thursday night, everything changed. Gideon came home later than usual. The moment he walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. His face looked pale, and he seemed exhausted. During dinner, he barely touched his food. He hardly said a word. Every time I asked if he was okay, he simply nodded and looked away. As the evening went on, the silence between us became unbearable. I kept wondering what had happened at work or whether he was dealing with some kind of problem he didn't want to share. A few hours later, he walked into our bedroom carrying a suitcase. At first, I thought he was leaving. Then he set the suitcase beside me. "Ren, you need to go," he said. I stared at him, sure I had heard him wrong. "What are you talking about?" I asked. His expression never changed. "Pack what you need and leave tonight." My heart started pounding. I asked him if this was some kind of joke, but he didn't answer. Instead, he slowly removed his wedding ring and held out his hand. "Give me yours too." I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Tears filled my eyes as I begged him to explain what was happening. I asked if he was seeing someone else. I asked if he wanted a divorce. I asked what I had done wrong. But Gideon refused to answer any of my questions. He just stood there looking cold and distant, like a stranger. Before midnight, I was standing outside in the rain with my suitcase. The front door closed behind me, and a few seconds later, I heard the lock click. I sat in my car crying, convinced that my marriage was over. What I didn't know was that someone very close to us had already started a dangerous chain of events that would change all of our lives. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gideon standing in front of me with that cold look on his face. By morning, I felt exhausted, confused, and completely lost. The hotel room felt small and lonely. I sat on the edge of the bed for hours, trying to understand what had happened. I went through every memory from the past few months, looking for signs that something had gone wrong between us. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Gideon had never treated me badly before. We had disagreements like any couple, but he was never cruel. He never raised his voice, never insulted me, and never made me feel unwanted. That was why his behavior felt so impossible to understand. When people heard what happened, they all reached the same conclusion. They believed he was having an affair. A few relatives called me throughout the day. Some sounded angry on my behalf. Others sounded curious. Everyone seemed certain they knew the answer. The person who stayed in touch the most was Declan Mercer, Gideon's cousin. Declan had been part of our lives for years. He always seemed dependable. He called several times to check on me and even brought coffee to the hotel one afternoon. "You need to start protecting yourself," he told me. "If Gideon is serious about ending things, you should prepare now instead of waiting." His words made sense. As painful as it was, I knew I couldn't spend every day crying and hoping for answers that might never come. Over the next few days, I started gathering paperwork, bank statements, property records, insurance information, tax documents. If a divorce was coming, I needed to be ready. Still, something continued bothering me. Gideon never contacted me once. No messages. No calls. Nothing. That should have convinced me he was guilty of something, but it didn't. Whenever I remembered that night, one detail refused to leave my mind. It wasn't his anger. It wasn't the suitcase or the ring. It was his face. For a brief moment before I walked out the door, I had seen something in his eyes. Fear. Not the fear of a man caught cheating. Not the fear of someone trying to escape responsibility. It looked more like the fear of someone watching a disaster happen and knowing he couldn't stop it. The memory stayed with me no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. Something about that night was still missing, and deep down, I knew I wasn't seeing the whole picture. The next morning, I was sitting by the hotel window when my phone rang. I almost ignored it because I was tired of talking to people. Most calls lately had been filled with opinions, advice, and questions I couldn't answer. When I looked at the screen, I saw the name Evelyn Cross. Evelyn was my elderly neighbor. She had lived across the street from us for years. She rarely called unless something was important. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. Her voice was shaky. "Ren, where are you?" she asked. "I'm at a hotel." "Good," she said quickly. "Listen to me carefully. Do not come home yet. I stood up immediately. What happened? There was a pause. Then she lowered her voice. You need to come near the neighborhood, but don't let anyone see you. Park somewhere away from the house. My stomach tightened. Evelyn, you're scaring me. I know, dear. Just trust me. Before I could ask more questions, she ended the call. For several seconds, I stared at my phone. Nothing about this made sense. I grabbed my keys and left. The drive felt much longer than usual. My mind raced through dozens of possibilities. Had there been a break-in? Was someone hurt? Had something happened to Gideon? As I got closer, I followed Evelyn's instructions and parked several houses away. The moment I looked toward my street, my heart nearly stopped. Police vehicles were everywhere. Not one or two. Several. They were positioned around the neighborhood in a way that immediately felt unusual. Their lights weren't flashing. No sirens were sounding. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. I stepped out of my car and watched from a distance. Officers moved carefully around my house. Some stood near the front entrance while others spread out around the property. The way they acted made it clear this wasn't a routine visit. They were expecting something. My hands started shaking. Why would police be surrounding my home? What was happening inside? I searched every face, hoping to see Gideon, but he wasn't there. Minutes passed. Then the front door opened. Several officers appeared. Between them was a man being escorted outside. At first, I couldn't get a clear look. Then he turned slightly. The breath left my body. It wasn't Gideon. It wasn't a stranger either. It was someone I had trusted for years. Someone who had comforted me after Gideon threw me out. Someone who had spent the last few days convincing me my marriage was over. It was Declan. And the expression on his face told me he knew exactly why the police were there. I stood frozen beside my car, staring at Declan. Nothing about the scene felt real. Just yesterday, he had been sitting across from me in the hotel lobby, listening while I cried. He had told me that I deserved better. He had encouraged me to prepare for divorce and move forward with my life. Now detectives were leading him across my front yard. One officer stopped him near an unmarked vehicle. Another began asking questions while a detective held a folder full of documents. Declan's calm and confident attitude was gone. For the first time since I had known him, he looked nervous. My mind struggled to catch up with what I was seeing. I took a few steps closer, trying to understand what was happening. Then I heard a familiar voice behind me. Ren. I turned around. Gideon stood a few feet away. The sight of him immediately brought back all the anger and hurt I had been carrying. He looked terrible. His clothes were wrinkled. Dark circles sat under his eyes. He looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. For several seconds neither of us spoke. I wanted answers, but I also wanted to yell at him. Finally, he broke the silence. I'm sorry. The words hit me harder than I expected. I crossed my arms and stared at him. Sorry? I said. That's all you have to say after what you did. He lowered his head for a moment. I never wanted you to leave. My frustration exploded. Then why did you throw me out? People nearby continued moving around the property, but in that moment I barely noticed them. I only cared about the man standing in front of me. Gideon looked directly into my eyes. Because I was trying to protect you. I almost laughed. Nothing about the last few days had felt like protection. He had broken my heart, left me alone, and refused to explain anything. Protect me from what? I demanded. His eyes shifted toward the house, then toward Declan. When he looked back at me, there was something I had never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, for me. I need you to listen, he said quietly. I shook my head. Start talking. Gideon took a slow breath. I know this sounds impossible, but everything that happened was connected to Declan. I stared at him in disbelief. The words made no sense. Declan was family. He was someone we trusted completely. But Gideon's expression told me he wasn't guessing. He knew something. And whatever he was about to tell me was serious enough to destroy everything I thought I knew about the people closest to us. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I stood there trying to process everything while police officers continued moving around the property. The world felt strangely quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat. Gideon led me a short distance away from the crowd. Once we reached a small bench near the corner of the street, he finally began explaining. Several weeks earlier, he had noticed something unusual while helping one of Declan's elderly clients with a paperwork issue. At first, he thought it was a simple mistake. Some numbers didn't match, and a few transactions seemed out of place. The more he looked into it, the more problems he found. Money had been disappearing from accounts belonging to older people who trusted Declan to manage their finances. Many of them never realized anything was wrong. According to Gideon, the missing amounts were often small enough to avoid attention. Over time, those amounts added up to a huge sum. When he discovered this, he started quietly gathering information. Then he found something much worse. My name appeared in several records connected to the money. At first, he thought there had to be some explanation. There wasn't. Someone had used my personal information on documents I had never seen before. Accounts had been connected to me without my knowledge. My hand started shaking as he spoke. I had never opened those accounts. I had never signed those papers. Yet on paper, it looked like I was involved. Gideon explained that when he confronted Declan privately, the conversation turned ugly very quickly. Declan didn't deny what he had done. Instead, he warned Gideon to stay out of it. He claimed that if investigators discovered everything too soon, the evidence could point directly at me. That threat terrified Gideon. He knew how serious the situation was becoming. Without telling anyone, he contacted investigators and shared everything he had found. For weeks they worked quietly, collecting evidence and building a case. Then a major problem appeared. Investigators learned that Declan suspected people were getting close to the truth. They believed he was planning to remove documents and electronic records connected to the fraud. Some of that evidence was linked to our home. That was why Gideon became desperate. The night he forced me to leave was the same night authorities warned him that Declan might try to destroy critical evidence. They wanted me far away from the house until they could move in. As I listened, the last few days suddenly looked completely different. What I thought was betrayal had actually been erased to keep me from becoming part of something dangerous. Over the next several days, I met with investigators more than once. At first, the conversations focused on financial records, documents, and timelines. I answered every question as honestly as I could. Then the subject slowly began to change. One investigator placed a folder on the table and opened it. Inside were copies of emails, text messages, and other records connected to Declan. Some of them immediately caught my attention. There were conversations between family members discussing arguments I remembered clearly. Arguments that had caused tension for years. The investigator pointed to one message. "Did you send this?" he asked. I looked at it carefully. No. The message had been sent from an account using my name, but I had never written those words. My stomach dropped. The investigator showed me another, and another. The pattern quickly became clear. Declan had been creating problems between people for years. He would tell one person that someone else had insulted them. He would pass along false information. Sometimes he changed messages before forwarding them. Other times he created fake conversations completely. The more evidence I saw, the worse I felt. Suddenly old family arguments started making sense. There had been holidays that ended in tension for reasons I never fully understood. There were relatives who became distant without explanation. There were moments when people seemed angry at me, even though I had done nothing wrong. For years I blamed myself. I thought I had said the wrong thing. I thought I had failed to fix relationships. Now I was discovering that many of those situations had been carefully created by someone I trusted. That realization hurt more than I expected. The financial crimes were terrible, but those involved money. This was different. This involved people. Memories began replaying in my head one after another. Birthday dinners, family gatherings, phone calls that ended badly, awkward conversations that never made sense. I started seeing them from a completely different perspective. Declan had always been there, listening, watching, positioning himself as the helpful person who could solve problems he secretly created. I remembered how often he seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment whenever conflict appeared. Back then I thought it was kindness. Now I understood something else. He wasn't fixing problems. He was managing the damage he caused. That night I sat alone in my hotel room for hours. I wasn't crying because of the fraud investigation. I was grieving someone who had never really existed. The brother I thought I had gained through marriage was nothing more than a mask. And the truth behind that mask was far uglier than I ever imagined. Even after learning the truth about Declan, I couldn't simply forgive Gideon and move on. Part of me understood why he had done what he did. Another part kept remembering that night. The suitcase. The locked door. The feeling of standing alone in the rain, believing my marriage had ended. Those memories didn't disappear just because I finally knew there was a reason behind them. A few days later, Gideon asked if we could meet somewhere quiet. I agreed. We met at a small park near the edge of town. The place was nearly empty. A few people walked their dogs in the distance while we sat on a bench overlooking a pond. For a while neither of us said much. Then Gideon finally spoke. "There are things I never told you." I listened without interrupting. He explained that during the investigation, authorities became increasingly concerned about Declan's behavior. The evidence against him was growing. The closer investigators got to the truth, the more unpredictable he became. They believed he had access to information stored inside our house. They also believed there was a chance he knew someone was looking into his activities. That possibility changed everything. According to Gideon, investigators worried that Declan might try something reckless if he felt trapped. He could destroy evidence. He could pressure witnesses. He could try to shift blame onto someone else. And because my identity had already been connected to some of the records, I was in a dangerous position. Gideon looked down at his hands before continuing. They told me the safest place for you was away from the house. I felt my throat tighten. He explained that there wasn't enough time to carefully prepare me or reveal the investigation. The situation was moving too quickly. If word reached Declan that authorities were closing in, nobody knew how he would react. So Gideon made a choice. A terrible choice. He decided it was better for me to hate him than to risk leaving me in the middle of something that could become dangerous. I knew what it would do to you, he said quietly. I knew you might never speak to me again. There was no anger in his voice. Only sadness. For the first time, I realized what those days had been like for him. While I was sitting alone in that hotel room, he had been carrying the weight of a decision he never wanted to make. The pain I felt was real. But so was his. As I sat there listening, tears filled my eyes, not because the past suddenly made sense, but because I finally understood how impossible his situation had been. And somehow, that hurt almost as much as everything that came before. For a short time, it felt like the truth was finally coming out. Then Declan decided he wasn't going down alone. The criminal case against him continued to grow, and the pressure around him increased every week. Instead of accepting responsibility, he started looking for ways to drag other people down with him. Soon new accusations began appearing. Through his attorneys, he claimed that Gideon had been involved in financial decisions connected to some of the accounts. In other statements, he suggested that I knew more than I admitted. The claims were false, but they created exactly the confusion he wanted. Some relatives who had recently learned about the investigation became uncertain again. They started asking questions. A few wondered if there was more to the story. I couldn't blame them completely. For years Declan had been skilled at making lies sound believable. But this time I wasn't willing to sit back and let him control the narrative. For the first time since everything began, I stopped reacting and started fighting back. I met with investigators whenever they needed information. I searched through old records, emails, and personal files. I answered every question carefully and honestly. The deeper we went, the clearer the picture became. Patterns started appearing everywhere. Investigators discovered examples of similar behavior stretching back years. Different names. Different situations. The same methods. People who had once trusted Declan began stepping forward. One former employee described being pressured to ignore suspicious transactions. A retired client explained how money had disappeared without clear explanations. Another person shared records showing inconsistencies that had never been properly addressed. The stories came from different places and different years, yet they all pointed in the same direction. As more evidence surfaced, Declan's version of events became harder to defend. The accusations against Gideon quickly fell apart once investigators reviewed the timeline. The claims against me collapsed as well. Documents that once looked suspicious now made sense when viewed alongside the full evidence. Even family members who had doubts started changing their minds. Several reached out to apologize for believing rumors. Others admitted they had ignored warning signs because they trusted Declan for so long. What struck me most was how many people had experienced the same thing. Different situations. Different consequences. The same manipulation. For years he had depended on confusion, silence, and divided loyalties. Now everything was being laid out in the open. One piece at a time, the story he had built around himself was falling apart. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Confidence. Not because the battle was over. Because the truth was finally stronger than his lies. The court hearings lasted for months. By then, I wasn't looking for revenge in the way people usually imagine it. I didn't want to see anyone suffer. I didn't want to scream or celebrate. I simply wanted the truth to be heard. Each hearing revealed another piece of what Declan had been hiding for years. Investigators presented financial records, witness statements, and business files that matched perfectly. Every document supported the next one. The judge listened carefully while experts explained how stolen identities had been used to move money between different accounts. My name was one of several that had been misused. The evidence showed that I had never approved any of it. Gideon was also cleared of every accusation. Watching those false claims disappear felt like a heavy weight lifting from my shoulders. Declan sat quietly through most of the hearings. He no longer looked like the confident man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. His attorneys continued trying to challenge the evidence, but every answer created more questions they couldn't explain. Outside the courtroom, his life was falling apart. His business closed. The accounts connected to his property remained frozen while the investigation continued. People who had worked with him started distancing themselves. Some former clients requested reviews of their financial records after learning what had happened. Family members who once defended him slowly accepted the truth. Several apologized to Gideon for doubting him. Others reached out to me with regret, admitting they should have trusted us instead of believing rumors. None of those apologies could erase the pain we had lived through. But hearing them still mattered. For the first time in months, I no longer felt like I had to prove I was innocent. The facts spoke for themselves. On the day the court reached its decision, I looked across the room at Declan. He didn't look angry. He looked empty. The life he had spent years building through lies had disappeared because the truth finally caught up with him. As Gideon and I walked out of the courthouse together, I stopped for a moment on the steps. The air felt lighter. For so long, fear had followed me everywhere. I had questioned my own memories, my own judgment, and even the people I loved. That burden was finally gone. The greatest revenge wasn't watching Declan lose everything. It was knowing he could never control our lives again. For the first time since that terrible night, I felt free to look ahead instead of constantly looking over my shoulder. Several months passed before life started to feel normal again. Gideon and I moved back into our house, but it didn't feel like the same place. Every room held memories of that painful night. For a while, even walking through the front door brought back emotions I thought I had already faced. We didn't pretend everything was fixed. Trust doesn't return all at once. It grows little by little through everyday actions. Gideon stopped keeping things to himself, even small worries from work. If something bothered him, he told me. I also learned to speak honestly instead of hiding my fears. We promised each other that silence would never again become part of our marriage. Some days were easier than others. There were moments when old memories returned without warning. Instead of ignoring them, we talked about them. Those conversations were not always comfortable, but they helped us heal. One evening, we sat together on the back porch as the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. The house was quiet. After a long silence, Gideon looked at me. If I could go back, he said softly, I would find another way. I hate knowing how much I hurt you. I reached for his hand. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I admitted something I had never said out loud. I almost gave up on us. I believed you had stopped loving me. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. I knew you might think that. Looking at him, I realized he had been carrying that guilt every day since everything happened. Neither of us could change the past. But we could decide how we wanted to live from that point forward. The person who almost destroyed our marriage was never standing between us as husband and wife. He had been standing beside us the whole time, pretending to care while secretly pulling us apart. That truth changed the way I looked at everything. Declan had lost his career, his money, and the trust of everyone who once believed in him. Those were the results of his own choices. As for Gideon and me, we gained something different. We learned that real trust isn't built during easy times. It is built when life falls apart and two people choose to face the truth together instead of walking away. When I think about that night now, I no longer remember only the pain. I remember what came after it. The truth, the healing, and the chance to rebuild a life that was stronger because it was finally built on complete honesty. That is the story I will carry with me for the rest of my life.